Tov. Today's daf yomi is Menachos daf ayin 70, but we're going to start on the last line of 69b. By Rabba or Rava, they asked the following question: Linya Meiser, with respect to tithing. Let's say we're talking about a plant, a stalk that was uprooted and then replanted. Hey Chidami, what's the scenario? Kigon, da'amdinu va'atzrinu. You guesstimated. Now, Meiser is supposed to be exact, but you can't do it exact. You can't do exactly 10% because you don't know exactly how many berries. You didn't thresh them out. So therefore, you just guesstimated, and then you tithe them. So you took a tithe. You had a question?
What is the question?
We're gonna ask it right now. So the amdinu vasrinu, you evaluated and you took a tithe on the produce, and then you replanted it. Vishatlinu, and you replanted vosifuhu, and now after you replanted it, it grew some more. So the question is, imtim telomar lo azlinam basar ikar tosefes ba'isur. Okay, we just established in the previous daf yesterday that we don't follow after the main thing. And the addition, you need to tithe. So you need to tithe whatever grows after you plant it. You for sure need to tithe. But the question is, Iker Mai, what about the main part that you took out and you replanted? You had already tithed it, but now that you replanted it, it grew some more. Do you also need to evaluate the original part and the tithe and to retithe the original part? That's the question. Do you need to retithe the original part? So, meaning basically you're taxing it twice, so to speak. Amarle Abaye.
Second time you just tax the increase.
No, that's the question. That's exactly the question. Obviously, you have to tax the increase. Question is, are you just taxing the increase, or are you taxing again the original part? That's precisely what the Gemara wants to know. Is the first part, is the root or the main thing that was replanted, is that being tithed twice? Except if it's part of the new plant. That's how do we look at it. So Amaroi Abaye says, well, Maishna Mikol Chiti Visori. Isn't that how everything grows? And even though we've tithed it, then we go and plant it again, it requires tithing again. You take a grain, you take a seed, even though you tithed it originally, and now you replant it, you have to tithe that part also. You can't deduct that from the tithing. So the Gemara says, yeah, for sure, if it's something where the seed disintegrates, for sure you need to include that again in the tithe and tithe it again because the seed disintegrates. I'm only asking about a question where where the seed does not disintegrate when it's replanted. And Gemara is going to give an example of that, like an onion bulb, which you plant and the bulb does not break down, it just grows more. So the Gemara says, well, Tifshal Mehad, why don't we explain this from the following case? The Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Litra Batzal, let's say you have a liter of an onion, Shetiknu, they tithed it, Vizaro Mitaster, Vizaro, and then you replanted it, Mitaser Fikulo. You include everything again. So even though you tithed it originally, we now have to retithe it. So the Gemara says, so we see from here that even though you originally tithed something, if you replant it, you have to tithe it again. So the Gemara says, no, but that case is different. Hasam, Hainu, that case over there, Hainu's Riaso. That is the way it's planted. That's the way you plant onions in general. But in our case over here, by a stalk, Lav Hainu's Riaso. The stalk, the seed disintegrates. So there's three things. There's a seed that disintegrates. So clearly you have to retithe that. Then there's an onion, which for sure does not disintegrate, and it's the way it's planted. Is you take a little bulb and you replant it. We're asking about a stalk, which is not typically the way it's not typically replanted. So what will be the law? So Amarle, before it answers it, the Gemara says, let's ask another question. Amarle Rabbi Chanina Bar Menyumi Abaye, Atzit sheinu nakov. Let's say you have a flower pot which has no hole in it, so it's basically disconnected from the ground. Mahu. What would be the law under those circumstances? Meaning, say, if a person separated a tithe from it, from something that grew in the flower pot that doesn't have a hole in it, on something on a flower pot. Uh, uh, so, so, so the Gemara says, well, what's the question here? What's exactly the question? Question is, ilo nakov, halo nakov, meaning to say, the assumption here of the Gemara is that we have to change the text a little bit and say you took a tithe on something that doesn't have a hole in it, on a flower pot that doesn't have a hole in it, it's not connected to the ground, on other stuff that grew that was not connected to the ground. So the Gemara says, well, what kind of question is it? If you're going to say ilo nakov, halo nakov, neither one has a hole in it, so of course you could do it. They're both only rabbinically obligated to tithe. Now Gemara says no. Dilma chazer v'nako vakvo ka'amris. Maybe the question is you're asking about a case where what's the case with one flower pot that after you took that basically the flower pot you planted the flower you put stuff in the flower pot and there's no hole in it and it grew and afterwards you made a hole in it and it grew some more and now the question is, should we say, how do we view the growth now? Do we say that the growth is not going to be connected to the root? It's basically the growth is biblically obligated. Do we say under this circumstances the root is going to be, or the main part that was originally planted is going to be dragged after the growth? And so therefore it's biblically obligated in a tithe. And so therefore we can take a tithe from the main thing onto the additional part because both of them have the same obligation. And so therefore you can't take it from a flower pot that has no hole in it on the part that the one that on the other pot. Meaning to say, how do we view the ikar there if it started to grow and then afterwards you made a hole in the flower pot, at which point the obligation became biblical? Do we view the original part as connected to the growth and there are certain consequences as a result of that, or do we not? You got a question? Yeah.
The assumption is that it's not growing in the ground, it's not forward. You don't tie it except rabbinically.
You tie the rabbinically, exactly.
Is that still the root? Is that the root?
Yeah, it's rabbinic type. So the Gemara says. So the Gemara says. So Abai says, well, in this case, you shouldn't have. It's obviously the case that the main part it goes after the additional part, and it's obligated. Why? Here, but it's not the same as before. Here, it's one planting. And so therefore, meaning to say you didn't replant it, you just made a hole. You just connected it further, but you never replanted it. But there, in the case of Rava, stays rios. Hasam stays rios ninu. In the case of Rava, there it's two plantings. And so therefore it's not, therefore we have a question. And so therefore we didn't answer that the question of Rava. So now the Gemara continues with the next case. The very beginning, Rava's question was about the tithe with respect to where you evaluated where you replanted it after you first tithed it. Yeah. So now the Gemara says, by Rabbi Avo, Shiboet Shemarcha B'Kri. Let's say you have a stalk that you piled it up, that you harvested it, and then basically you piled it up into a bushel, Ushasoa, and then you replanted it, the Karo Hashem, and then you b'mechubar, and afterwards you tithed it when it was attached to the ground. So typically speaking, this is not what's done. You're supposed to tithe something after it's detached on the ground. You're not supposed to tithe while it's attached to the ground. But now in this case, you did tithe while it's attached to the ground. Do we say, Kivin de Mercha, Tavula, since you piled it up, therefore it was called Tevel, and so which is basically produce which you have, which is untithed, and Kikara Hashem, Kachalay. And so now after you tithed it, it's okay. It's considered a valid tithe. Or maybe you replanted it, and so therefore it's still attached to the ground, and so therefore it's not called tevel anymore, so you can't tithe it yet. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbanu Abaye, wait 1 second. So what you're saying is, how can you say you tithe something once it's attached to the ground? Is that really the case? So according to you, we have a scenario where there's tithing while it's attached to the ground. But that can't be. V'tanan, and we learned in the Mishnah. Now, the Mesorah Hashaf on the top right corner of our Gemara is before the days of computers, was able to give us a cross-reference to every citation in the Talmud. He did that before the days of the computers. But he writes here, with just tremendous humility, he writes here, if you look at the top right corner, bet, the footnote bet, he says, Lakotzer daiti, he says, to my, small knowledge, this is what he's writing, Lo yadati litzayim mekomo b'mishnah o brisa. He says, I don't know where this source is. I don't know the Mishnah or the Brisa. He says, my limited knowledge. That's because, so other commentaries try to figure out where is it, but it's never explicitly stated. Right there. This is the Mesorah Hashaf. So he says, I don't know where this source is that says that you can't tithe while it's attached to the ground, but it says, so you can't take the tithe while it's attached to the ground. Amarle, yeah. So they respond. So he responds, Amarle, Abaye said to the people in the yeshiva, Kitanya he, this brisa that says that you can't do truma when it's attached to the ground, that's l'inyan achayuve misa v'chomesh. That's to say that if you tithed it while it's attached to the ground, if you ate truma while it's attached to the ground, then you're not going to be liable for death or pay the extra 1/5. The talish v'achil, because if a person removes it, talish lahu, he could eat it. The gachin v'achil. And if he bends down and eats it while it's still attached to the ground, then we're going to see that this is not the typical way we do something. And so therefore, we're not going to make him liable for death or pay the 1/5 penalty for eating truma while it's attached to the ground. That's all we're saying. That's all that Mishnah is saying. But still, we have a question. If you can actually declare a tithe while it's attached to the ground. And then if a person will take it and eat it, will he be liable? So the Gemara says, well, why is this case different than that which is written in the ledger of Ilfa? Ledger of Ilfa, who's Ilfa? Do you remember from the Gemara in Tainus, Ilfa, we talked about in Tainus, that Ilfa was the one who, with Rabbi Yochanan, they were both in the basement in the yeshiva together, and Ilfa decided to go into business. And Rabbi Yochanan was going to go into business with him, but when they were on the way, Rabbi Yochanan heard the angels telling him, "I heard the angels speaking," and Ilfa didn't hear it, so Ilfa didn't go back. And Rabbi Yochanan went back. Have a good day, Harold. Shekoyach. So. Because what does it say in the ledger of Ilfa? Beitza nivos ha'of hatar. Let's say you have, now we know that if there is a non-kosher bird, that's a nevela, a bird that's a nevela that wasn't slaughtered, then you become tameh not by touching it, but by swallowing it when it's in your throat. So let's say you have the eggs of such a bird. Beitzei nivelos ha'of hatar. So the eggs are partially in. Miksasan b'chutz miknasan mifnim. It died while it was laying the egg. So mibifnim itamin begadim. Then if you eat the part while it's still inside the bird, then your garments are tame abeis abliya. Mibechutz. But if you eat it after the eggs came out, emitam begadim abeis abliya. Then it does not. Then it's not going to be mitame the begadim by swallowing it. Tawosh avidi in.
Does this mean contaminate clothing?
No, he also becomes tummy, but also his clothing. So also his clothing.
Extra.
No, the unusual thing is that it becomes normally it will become tame when you touch it, but here it's becoming tame while you're swallowing it only. So that also makes your garments tame. So so we see from this that these eggs, when they're inside the bird itself, even though people don't typically eat in this manner, we're going to say that it's considered achila. We don't say that this is not considered eating. And so too, with respect to the truma that's attached to the ground, you should say you should be obligated, even though people don't typically eat it while it's attached to the ground. Gemara says no. Hold on one second. Let me just finish the sentence. Towash avidi inish to achi achi. So the Gemara says no. If something is removed from the ground, basically this something which is typically going to be removed. Then we're going to see people typically eat it that way, and so therefore it's considered eating even while it's attached to the ground, because the egg is eventually going to be, obviously it's going to be soon removed. But something that's still attached to the ground, people don't typically eat it, so therefore there's a distinction between the two cases. Yes, I'm sorry, what was your question?
The note says he bends down and eats the eggs while it's still in the birds have done it.
Exactly, that's it.
It's still got shell.
Well, when the egg is in the inside, it has a much softer shell. Also, you could be talking about a case where the shell cracked inside or something. Okay, so now we say, chitin. Has anybody ever seen you slaughtered a chicken, and if you slaughter a chicken and the eggs are inside of it, if you've ever seen that, which I have, the eggs are fleshik. Those eggs are fleshik. They have the love of the chicken, but also those eggs are softer. The shell becomes harder when they come out. So now we're up to the next Mishnah, which is directly relevant to the holiday coming up of Pesach. Hachitin v'asa'oren v'akusmin v'ashibo ashul v'ashifon. So this is chitin is wheat, se'oren is barley, kusmin is spelt, shibo ashul is I think oats, and shifon is rye. I don't. First of all, I'm translating the way it's typically translated, but we don't know 100% that our grains today match up to those grains the way they're translating it. But we just assume that these are the 5 grains that match our 5 grains, which are also the 5 grains that you can make matzah from. All these types of grains, if you make them into bread, you have to tithe them. If you make them into dough, you have to give a gift to the Kohen. That's called challah. And they combine with each other. We'll see what that means. Basurim b'chadash mifnei Pesach u'militzor mifnei Omer. And they're prohibited as new grain before Pesach, and you can't harvest them before you bring the Omer. If they took root before the Omer, Omer matiran. The Omer is what's going to allow them to be eaten. But otherwise, if they did not take root before the Omer, asurin achayavo Omer abba. If they're not, then they're prohibited until achayavo Omer abba, until the next Omer is brought. Tana kusmin is min chitim. Kusmin is a type of wheat. Shibol ashul v'shifon min se'or. And shibol ashul and shifon are types of barley. Kusmin is called, they're called in Aramaic gulba. Rashi says ashpilta. which is spelt. Shifon is called dishra. Dishra is, Rashi says in French, is called stigla. Shibboleth Shul is called Shibboleth Tawa, which is avinya, which I usually typically called oats. Yeah.
In the Mishnah, if they don't take root before the omen, then they're forbidden until the next omen. So
Yeah.
that means you can't harvest them at all because they're not going to last. It's not going to last an entire year in the ground.
Is the prohibition? The prohibition. No, I guess it would last. Why do you say it won't last in the ground?
It's Talmud and I don't know. I just assume that if there's a harvest season, you plant it sometime around the spring, and then it's going to be harvested around the fall. If you don't harvest it, it's going to like wither and rot. So not going to last until next spring. Maybe it will.
Well, the issue is that when would it be typically planted? I don't know. It could be that would be the problem, but I don't think it would have been a problem because they're not going to plant something that would have that consequence. So now we say, Hani in. You mean to say that these 5 grains are obligated in challah, but orez v'dochan but rice and millet is like a, you know what millet is. They are not going to be obligated in challah. Menachos immediately. What's the source for this idea? Amrei Shlakish. Asya lechem mimatzah. We learn out by comparing it to matzah. It says bread here. With respect to the challah, it says vayah be'echa ba'acholchem milechem haaretz. When you eat from the bread of the land, and it says by matzah, called lechem oni, the bread of the oni. So both of them, the word lechem is used. And just like matzah is only kosher when it's made from these 5 grains, what we call today wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye, also challah is only obligated from these 5 grains. And how do we know with respect to matzah itself that rice and millet are not kosher? You know what I eat chametz? 7 days you shall eat matzos, lechem oni. Something that becomes ferment, able to be leavened. So a Pesach, then a person who fulfills obligation on Pesach. Excludes these. They do not, when they left out, they don't leaven, but they get ruined. And so therefore you can't fulfill the obligation of matzah on Pesach. Mitzvah from zemzeh, and they combine with each other. Tana, what does it mean that they combine with each other? Hatvua v'akamachem v'abatsekos mitzvah from zemzeh. That the grain and the flour and the dough all combine. So what do you mean they combine? So it says Rav Kahana, Le'inyan Chadash. Let's say you eat them before the Omer. That if a person put together an olive-sized amount of the grain, the flour, and the dough, and he ate them, then he would get lashes. You combine it all to get to the olive-sized amount. Rav Yosef Omer, Le'inyan Chametz v'Pesach. If you combined on Pesach, some of the wheat berries with the flour, with the dough, and outside amount, you're going to be liable on Pesach. Or Papa says in your Meister Sheni that if you ate it outside of Jerusalem, if you ate it outside of the walls, your lashes. Rava Amar in Tumas Ochent with respect to once you have an outsized amount, the size of an egg, which is Tumas Ochent, transmits Tuma with the size of an egg, then we're going to say it transmits to Mav. Is teaching us the Tvu Kamach and Dumya de Betekos, that the berry and the flour is similar to the dough. Ma'asam Ochla Be'ene, just like with respect to the dough, that it is considered actual food without any mixture. Afachanami, also with respect to the grain and the flour, Ochla Be'ene. Only the food itself is what combines without any of the other stuff that, like the bran that gets mixed in. Vatanya, is this really the case? Chita ben kufa ben she'ena kufa mitzarefes. The grain, whether or not you peeled it. I mean, even with the bran on it, is going to combine. So ora, the barley kufa mitzarefes and a kufa mitzarefes. So you eat the bran on the wheat, but not the barley. So therefore, the bran on the wheat combines to make the amount, but not the bran on the barley. The Gemara says, "Any is this case? Is this the case? Vatana debei Rabbi Shmuel. I'll call Zera Zerua Asher Yizareya. It says in the pasuk about Tumas Ochan on any seed that was planted. Kederach Sheminei Adam Motzin Lazriya Chita Beklipasa Saor Beklipasa Vadasha Beklipasan. That how does it transmit tuma? Even when it's in its shell, like the wheat in the shell. Gemara says Lokashia Ha Belachos Ha V'Yaveshos. The first price. The second bride, so Tani Be'er Shmuel, is dealing with the moist, brand, and so therefore they're able to combine. But the first price is dealing with the dry ones, and so therefore they don't combine. So what's the difference? Rashi writes that the fresh ones or the moist ones, they can last on the seed, and it's like guarding it, and so it's like a shomer. Or else, alternatively, they are edible, where unlike the dry ones, they don't protect the plant, and also they're not edible. And they're prohibited in chadash prior to Pesach. Menani milia. How do you know this? Only these 5 grains are prohibited. Again, we learn out from probably comparing. Again, you can't harvest it before the Omer. We compare Gzer Shavat to Chala. What does it mean when it says that it's prohibited Kodem Omer? Rabbi Yonah Omer Kodem Ketziras Omer. He says you can't harvest it before you harvest the Omer. Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda Omer Kodem Havas Omer, before you bring the Omer. Tanan, so how do we answer this? Asuran bechadash lefnei Pesach, v'litzor lefnei Omer. They're not allowed. The chadash is prohibited before Pesach, and to harvest before the Omer. Bishlam Oman Damar Kodem Avas Omer. It makes sense when it says that it's prohibited before the bringing of the Omer. That's why it didn't list the two things together. I need a little carvlu, but tiny little. That's why it didn't list them together. Oman Damar Kodem Ketziras Omer. They are vinable sin, but according to one, it says it's prohibited before the harvesting Omer. It should list them together. Asur mechadash v'leftor lifnei Pesach. So it should have listed like that. Eliyit mar aseifa mar. So Gemara says this dispute was listed about the seifa of the Mishnah. That if they took root before the Omer allows it. My kodam Omer. What does it mean before the Omer? Rabbi Yonah Omer kodam Eivas Omer. Before the Omer was brought. Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda Omer kodam Ketziras Omer. He says before the harvesting of the Omer. I will stop here. Baruch Hashem. This is today's Daf Yomi. Shkoyach.